Hi everybody, happy Tuesday and welcome to another episode of this. Boy, the hair has a life of its own today, folks. I'm sorry. No, I'm not. What do you care? So I know last week I said today we would be talking about holiday horror movies, but life got in the way and the subject has changed. So this past Sunday we learned that Anne Rice had died. And you normally, that's worth taking a moment and just kind of contemplating this very prolific author, the best-selling female horror author of all time, okay? And she's like just behind Stephen King as the number 2 best-selling horror author. And normally I wouldn't have really bothered. I would have just been like, yeah, Anne Rice, I've made my feelings about her known. Obviously a fan, moving on. But all of the posts online, there were many that were completely respectful. There were many that were completely, well, I never read her, but, or there were a lot, of people who knew her personally, who were heartbroken, and which made, these attention-seeking idiots that I'm getting ready to talk about all the more egregious. The people who came on and went, well, I don't know who she is. I'm an aspiring horror author. Who's Anne Rice? I don't like monster books that aren't actually about monsters. I hate supernatural romance, blah, 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 blah. People were actually doing that because for some odd reason, social media tends to bring out the shit goblins in everybody. Hence why I'm rarely there. I creep around, I read stuff because for some odd reason I'm a masochist and I have to do this. But the whole attitude around her and her death, whereas it lacked the respect that I think she was deserved. So what I want to do today is do sort of a video version, a mini version of my podcast, A Case for Classics. And honestly, there is an episode up there, back when all of this was a Patreon account. The videos and the bonus episodes of that podcast, they were all Patreon exclusive content. And I would do bonus episodes on there about authors and works that weren't necessarily classics of literature. And I did one on Anne Rice. And I repurposed it and made it a longer episode for the podcast after the Patreon thing died. But I want to kind of do one of those because here's the thing. I understand horror fans not being into Anne Rice. That's beside the point. My problem is the people who dismiss her and her works out of hand without trying them, without really looking into them. I have a problem with that. And we'll get into details later. What I'm trying to do is I'm basically today making a case for Anne Rice because there really was a lack of respect for that author on the day that her death was announced. And I've kind of walked away from it feeling completely disgusted. There was a lot of respect. It's just there wasn't enough. So let's get the obvious out of the way. The modern romantic version of the vampire, I don't think would exist as it is if it weren't for Anne Rice and her Vampire Chronicles. Being someone who, as a horror fan, I do usually prefer my vampires to be monsters. I do usually prefer them to be bad guys. That's just how I like it. I prefer the monstrous version. I prefer the othering of them in their monstrous form. Now, having said that, I've never read the Twilight books. I'm not here to shit on them. I'm not going to do it. But I've never read them because I know it wouldn't be my thing. But obviously it's a thing for other people. The Southern Vampire Mystery Series, the Sookie Stackhouse books, I love those books. I've read the entire series like 4 times because they're hilarious. They have a great female protagonist. They're realistic. Sometimes as a horror fan, I find myself starving for relatable female protagonists. because a lot of the female protagonists in horror are written by men. And not to criticize them, because a lot of the men do a great job. We have a lot of empathetic, insightful writers in the horror genre. And I think that's something, the genre as a whole gets overlooked because of that, because without these relatable, sympathetic characters, the horror doesn't work, right? And I'm not complaining necessarily, but there are aspects of a woman's life, especially the inner workings of a woman, that men just naturally aren't going to get. And I mean, some of my favorite books, one of my favorite Stephen King horror books is Rose Madder. And I think he did a fantastic job writing a female main character. Gerald's Game, fantastic job. But sometimes I need that female perspective, and I got that from the Southern Vampire Mystery Series. Now, I think those books could have worked without the vampires. I think the stories, it could have been retooled a little bit. So I like them not because of the vampires, is what I'm saying. I like them because of Sookie. I read a lot of Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles, and I enjoyed them. I tapped out at Vittorio the Vampire, and I think that's either 6 or 7. I can't remember. It started kind of getting old for me because, I don't know, Anne Rice had a style that I really liked. I really liked her writing style. I really liked her storytelling style. I just kind of started getting tired of those vampires. My favorite of the Vampire Chronicles is far and away Blood and Gold. I saw quite a few people talking about Interview with the Vampire, which is a great book, and The Vampire Lestat, which is also a fantastic book. If you want to read those, if you want to give them a try, those are the two you should start with. I have a taste for kind of historical fiction, kind of works that have a chronology to them, and that's why I really love Blood and Gold. That's also why I really love The Witching Hour, which is the first of her Mayfair Witches series. There's a family tree thing going on with those books that I really, really loved. And when it comes to historical fiction, like seriously, Anne Rice was top notch. She did such a good job. And even when you know that she was fudging some details, like an anthropologist or historian is going to read some of this and, you know, their head's going to explode because she got things wrong. That's not the point of historical fiction. Fiction is the operative word there. It's getting you sucked in and putting you in a place that you know happened in our history, but, you know, there are certain details that she kind of susses so that it's relatable to a modern mindset. And like Servant to the Bones, or Servant of the Bones, Servant Bones, that book, that's a really interesting book because the beginning takes place in ancient Babylon, and this kind of Babylonian execution / curse that happens where we end up getting the Servant of the Bones. It's very immersive. It's very interesting. I love that book. But to keep you from falling into that trap of dismissing Anne Rice, because a lot of people will say that Anne Rice's works are gothic romance. And that's one of those things where it's not wrong, but it's not completely right either. That's a very, I think, subjective categorization of her works. They're definitely gothic, like definitely gothic. And gothic is a subgenre of horror. It exists under there. There's that spooky element. But romance. See, yeah, but there is horror in her books. It's just not where you expect it to be. Let me explain. When you're reading a book about vampires, you're expecting it to be a monster book. You're expecting it to be body horror, especially when we come to vampires. And wait a minute, there is an essence of body horror to her works. It exists in The Witching Hours, more towards the end, but it exists in, like, Interview with the Vampire for certain, The Vampire Lestat for certain, The Tale of the Body Thief for certain. touches of body horror. But the thing is, when you're reading these books and you're expecting a monster, you're getting these very navel-gazing kind of characters who their problem is existential. And the horror in these books is existential. It's personal and it's earth-shattering to them, but not on a wider base. Like, they're not worried about the greater problems of the world. They're very worried. It's very self-centered, their problems. But there is something existentially horrifying about these vampires, about the possibility of immortality, about the possibility of, these vampires, they do have relationships with people and they do love them. Now, we have to talk, like, if you're thinking about vampires loving people in the way that, like, in True Blood, the vampires love people. No. Anne Rice's vampires were incapable of sex. It's something that's hinted about a lot in the regular books, where drinking each other's blood is an erotic experience for them, but their bodies don't work like that anymore. You really get a good look at this in The Tale of the Body Thief, which is not my favorite book in the series, but it does give insight into what it's like to be a vampire in comparison to being a human. Now, in Tale of the Body Thief, Lestat is visited by this man who tells him, we can switch minds. I can put your mind in a new body. And he presents Lestat with this, what you would consider to be the optimum male specimen. He's tall, he's muscular, he's young, very good looking. And this body thief tells him, I can put you in this body. Wouldn't you like to be human again? And Lestat is a very angsty kind of vampire. He has a lot of malaise when it comes to being immortal. The other vampires kind of get on his nerves. He doesn't have great relationships with them. And the ones that he does maintain a friendship with, he gets sick of them after a while. There's a whole lot of, these vampires will sleep for decades on end because they're fucking sick of existence. And, Lestat is certainly one who struggles with that. So he's able to inhabit a human body again, but there's a whole new set of horrors that come with this being who for centuries by this point has been a vampire. The things that he thought he missed, they go awry. Like, okay, so Anne Rice's vampires, their bodies do not create waste. The blood goes in and all of it is used up. Do you get what I'm saying? Vampires don't go to the bathroom. As a human, he eats spaghetti. He goes to his restaurant and he eats spaghetti, and the way she describes it is so brilliant, because I think about it all the time. The way a vampire has to consume, there's a lot of really aggressive sucking. Of course, in the movies they try to make it look more lazy, and I guess it looks sexier if they're just kind of licking, but in the books, you gotta really suck that blood out. So it's really aggressive sucking and hard swallowing. And because he's used to that, he doesn't think. He takes this gigantic bite of scalding hot spaghetti and swallows it down really hard and ends up really hurting himself. So that's a bad experience. He has sex with someone, that's a bad experience. And then, inevitably, after all that spaghetti, what goes in? The waste must come out, and that's a horrible experience for him. And he decides, I don't like this. I want to go back to being a vampire. But this stuff, there's a lot of character building. There's a lot of kind of inside angst, a lot of angst. All these vampires are so angsty. They are never fully at peace with this immortality thing. But that in itself carries its own kind of horror, this existential horror. And again, I understand why people wouldn't like this, especially horror fans. I understand, I get it. My problem is the people who won't even pick up a book, who won't even try it. And that is a problem, because not only are you limiting yourself, you're not giving yourself a chance to at least try, you're discounting the most successful female horror author of our time. You're discounting all of these works, and she has a lot to choose from. Not all of it's vampire, not all of it's witches. Again, Servant to the Bones. That's a completely weird, like almost a genie. It grants wishes, but it's also like it's a weird book, but it's interesting. Her writing is interesting. She had a beautiful way of writing, and I just, it annoys me when people are just like, no, because it's not fair. It's not fair to you, and it's not fair to her and her works, and it's not fair to her fans. And I can tell you right now, it warmed my heart to see that a lot of the people who were saying this book meant a lot to me, they weren't all women. There were a lot of men who came on and talked about Interview with the Vampire and the Vampire Lestat. Those two seem to really be the most prominent. So the good news here is that if you want to give Anne Rice a try, and you're dubious, which again is understandable, her stuff doesn't have the best reputation among horror people because of the people that just dismiss it out as fan, who just dismiss it as romance, who just dismiss it as proto-Twilight. And Twilight's not horror, I get it, that's also fine, but it's not garbage either, because look at the huge fan base. It obviously hit a nerve. So the good news here is that Anne Rice and her works are well represented in the library system. If you have a working library card, if you're able to be able to do that, and you don't want to go to the library and look for one of her books, if you listen to A Case for Classics, I talk about it all the time. In case you don't, download the Libby app, Libby. It is a library app, and you input your library card information. If you're a good person, you have a library card. If you don't have a library card, either fix it or live as a garbage person. I don't know what to do for you. You should have a library card. But you put in your library card information, and through the Libby app, you can borrow ebooks and audiobooks, depending on what they have available. And Anne Rice is very well represented in the library system. It would be very easy to get one of her books. Now, just because she recently died, you might have to put a few of them on hold, but it's a very easy app to use. It's very immersive. It's very, it's easy to understand. There's nothing tricky about it. And you could get ebooks or audiobooks of just take a pick. Take a pick. A lot of people, it's Interview with the Vampire, which is not a long book. It wouldn't take you long at all to get through it. Or The Vampire Lestat, or Servant to the Bones, also not a long book. You can get through these. I understand, you know, how many books did the Vampire Chronicles end up getting to? Was it 8? 9? I don't think she got to 10, but it's very long, and I understand series are, they're a big commitment. The good news, though, is if you read at least Interview with the Vampire, which turns out to be its own kind of clusterfuck when you get to the rest of them, and the Vampire Lestat, you can pick and choose through the rest of them. They all kind of stand alone after you get that foundation done. They don't have to all be read at the same time. Like Queen of the Damned kind of is its own standalone book. It's better to read it after Blood and Gold, but you don't have to. You will be able to get what's going on. And that's the good news. So if you want to give her a try, you don't have to spend money. Go to the library apps, and you know, maybe your library, my public library locally isn't very well represented online. I can't do too much, and my local branch is it serves a different purpose than physical books. We'll just say that. The librarians are great people, and I can get books in if I request them, but it serves a different purpose. There's, and it's a good purpose. I'm not going to crap talk it, but through the Libby app, I can get just about anything. I use it all the time for A Case for Classics. So if you want to give it a try, that's a great way to do it without having to commit to any money. And if you end up not liking it, wait for the Libby app to take it back. It's no big deal. Just don't be one of those people that's like, I know I wouldn't like it. How the fuck would you know? Give her a try. As you can tell, I'm worked up and over caffeinated. My apologies. Anne Rice, birth name Howard Allen Francis O'Brien. Her birth name was Howard. Come on, that's amazing. She deserved a lot of respect because she was an amazing creator. She was an amazing storyteller, and she was an amazing writer. When you read a lot, especially in the smaller presses, you will find that not all storytellers are great writers. And Anne Rice was a great writer. And you're robbing yourself of a possibility by just dismissing her out of hand. And I would hope to see less of that. And I would hope to see more respect and credit given to her for what she contributed. Not blame, not anger, credit. Because she dared in a time when it wasn't a popular thing to do, to give us a very deep insight into the mind of our monsters. You very easily could take the vampire Lestat and make him the outsider in a small New England town, and he very much would be a monster, going through and killing people. You know, they did try to make their hunting low-key. They would go after people that wouldn't be missed. But in a small town, that's the point. Everybody's missed in a small town, and the vampire Lestat would very much be a monster. But because of how they're portrayed, because of the intimate look that we get, it's something else entirely. So just give it a try. Give her works a try. And if you've already tried them and discovered it's not your thing, I'm not mad at you. You're not one of the people I'm yelling at right now. I completely get it, because it's always a possibility. There are people out there who don't like Stephen King, which when I first heard about that, it blew my mind. It's like, how? But it's a thing. And you begin to learn very quickly how subjective these things are. So because I loved Anne Rice, I also can understand why it wouldn't be their thing, especially horror fans. There is a big possibility it wouldn't be your thing. But there's also a big possibility, like, okay, if you like biographies, I really think you'd like Anne Rice's works. If you like historical fiction, you would really like Anne Rice. There's more to it than just sensitive vampires. And there are the sensitive vampires, but there's also sensitive vampires who fight, and they fight dirty, and they have these wars, but they also make friends, and they also make enemies, and it's messy, and it doesn't get the credit it deserves for being more than just kind of pretty angsty vampires with long flowing hair. Which Interview with the Vampire, that movie, is still superb. That movie is amazing. That movie is beautiful. The music, everything about it, fantastic. I would even venture to say I like it better than the book. And anybody who indulges on anything I put out on the internet, you know that's hard for me to say. So, but the whole point of this is, again, give it a try. Just a try. And it's really easy for you to do it without having to sacrifice anything, except a little bit of time. On A Case for Classics, the whole thing is give it that one chapter try. And, I mean, in one chapter you can tell, maybe not if you like the story so much, but you can tell if the style of writing is your thing. Not well, I mean, if you're going into it already not wanting to do it, one chapter is more than enough for you. But if you go in with an open mind, give it a chance. That one chapter try. It's no skin off your nose. You can do it. So, anybody out there, are you fans of Anne Rice? What's your favorite work? My favorite, I don't know. I don't know what my ultimate favorite is. Of the vampire books, it's definitely Blood and Gold. But I gotta tell you, I really liked The Witching Hour. I thought that was a fantastic book. It's very long. And again, it's very full of family history. I would like to get my hands, there's a book out there called Lasher, which is kind of attached to that. I'd like to get my hands on that and give it a read. And you know what, I might, in honor of her, and kind of thumbing my nose at the people who so disrespected that woman. read some Anne Rice this weekend. So that'll be it for me. Unless another catastrophic thing happens or something that just annoys me completely happens, we will talk holiday horror next week. Super promise. Yeah, because I love holiday horror. I've got to talk about it because I want to talk about it with you guys and get your input, because what a weird kind of mishmash of genres. Holiday movies are supposed to be about, well, you think about the Hallmark movies where all relationships are decidedly dry and full of hot cocoa and cookies, and not my thing. I understand why a lot of people like it. It's very superficial, very pretty. Those movies are very pretty, but they're very superficial, and but that's kind of what Christmas movies are. Very superficial, very pretty, very happy, or fraught with the annoyances of having to be with family. But then we get the horror side of it, and it's amazing how well it works, right? Like, isn't that crazy? So next week, super promise, I just had to get this off my chest. If you've never tried her, or if you found yourself being like, I know I wouldn't like her, you might give her a try. And then let me know what you thought, okay? So that'll be it for me this week. I will see you all next week. So let's see. Bye-bye. Come on, remote.